On the last day of 2024, in a Trump World Tower apartment overlooking the East River, an 84-year-old woman was found dead in her bed. Her last bank statement showed less than $1,000. Her last photograph, taken at a Manhattan restaurant a few weeks earlier, showed the face the tabloids had spent 30 years mocking. Once, she had been the gatekeeper of one of the greatest secret art collections on Earth. Once, she had walked through vaults filled with Vermeers and Caravaggios. The story of how Jocelyn Wildenstein got from those vaults to that empty bedroom is the story of what it costs to love a husband whose family taught him not to love you back. If you find yourself drawn to the stories the obituaries got wrong, the women the gossip columns flattened into a punchline, then subscribe. I tell those stories carefully here, and there are many more to come. Chapter 1. The Swiss Girl Who Aimed Higher Than Her Birth. In Lausanne. In 1940, a sporting goods retailer's daughter was born into the wrong country and the wrong class for the life she intended to live. Her name on the birth certificate ran long, Jocelynis Dianis da Silva Bezerra Perisset. The family called her Joceline. The shop her father ran sold rifles and skis. The town she grew up in was tidy, narrow, and small. Lake Geneva sat at the bottom of the streets, and the Alps sat behind the town like a wall. The young Jocelyn understood, very early, that everything important in her world happened somewhere else. She was a quick child. She learned French first, then German, then enough English and Italian to read magazines from Paris and Milan and London. She loved horses. She loved guns. By 13, she was riding the family's old hunter through the foothills behind the town. And by 16, she was shooting at the local rifle club well enough to embarrass the men. None of this was unusual in post-war Switzerland. What was unusual was the appetite she showed for the world beyond the shop. She was good-looking, in a way Lausanne understood, and Paris did not yet care about. She was tall, slim, dark-eyed. She had what older women in the town called good bones. She used those bones to get out. By the late 1950s, she was working occasionally as a model and a hostess in Geneva. By the early 1960s, she was in Paris, drifting through the edges of the fashion world. She was photographed at a few minor events, never at the center of the frame. She lived in small rented rooms. She was, by her own later account, perpetually broke. In 1964, when she was 24, she married the Italian film and music producer Cyril Piguet. He was older. He had money. He was not famous. The marriage ran a few years and ended quietly. There were no children. She kept his name on some documents for a while and dropped it on others. The marriage gave her her first true sense of how marriage worked at the upper edges of European society, as a deal arranged between two people who needed something from each other and were honest enough not to confuse the deal with romance. She drifted through Geneva, Paris, and Rome through the 1970s. She made friends among the kind of rich men who traveled to dangerous places for sport. She learned how to handle a rifle on safari. She learned how to read animals in scrub country. She slept in tented camps in Tanzania and the Sudan. By her late 30s, she had become a kind of professional companion to those expeditions, a woman who knew the routines, who could pack a kit, who could hold her tongue when men wanted to feel important, and who could draw them out when they did not. In 1977, at 37, she joined a hunting party at a ranch in central Kenya called Old Jogi. The ranch belonged to the Wildenstein family. She did not know what the name meant. The men in the camp tried gently to tell her. She nodded and went to clean her rifle. 24 hours later, across a campfire on the edge of the Aberdare Range, she would meet Alec Wildenstein, and her life would split into a before and an after she could never repair. Chapter 2. A Wildenstein. Across the campfire. Alec Wildenstein had been raised on art and horses, and on the understanding that what looked like marriage was actually inventory. He was born in Paris in 1940, the same year as Jocelyn, into a family already 3 generations into its dominance of the international art trade. His grandfather Georges had built galleries on 3 continents. His great-grandfather Nathan had begun the whole story as a former tailor from Alsace, who recognized a boucher in a Paris apartment in the 1870s and started selling old master paintings to American industrialists. By the time Alec was a child, the Wildensteins owned more important paintings than most national museums. The inventory was secret, the records were private, The financial structures, by Alec's father, Daniel's design, ran through trusts in the Bahamas, the Channel Islands, and the Caymans. The family lived between Paris and New York. The gallery at number 19 East 64th Street in Manhattan was a Beaux Arts mansion designed by Horace Trumbauer in 1932. It had no sign on the door. Visits were by appointment, by invitation, or by introduction from someone the family already trusted. Daniel Wildenstein was the architect of the modern Wildenstein Empire. He sat on the boards of the most important French museums. He wrote the scholarly catalogues raisonnées for Manet, Monet, and Gauguin that became the official record of those artists' works. To be excluded from a Wildenstein catalogue raisonné was to have your painting drop in value by half overnight. To be included was to be authenticated for life. Daniel was therefore, in a quiet way, the most powerful art historian in the second half of the 20th century. He was also a deeply private man with a low opinion of foreigners, an even lower opinion of women without money of their own, and a near-religious devotion to the secrecy of the family's holdings. Alec was the elder of Daniel's two sons. His younger brother was Guy. The two boys had been raised together inside the gallery, taken on rounds of clients from childhood, taught the difference between a Fragonard and a Watteau before they could ride. By his late 20s, Alec could move a Vermeer through 3 private collectors in 3 countries with a series of phone calls. He spoke 5 languages. He drove fast cars. He kept a string of girlfriends in 3 cities. He had the casual, slightly bored manner of a man for whom money had stopped being a question very early in life. He had also become, by the time he was 37, an enthusiastic big game hunter. The family had bought the Old Jogi Ranch in central Kenya in the early 1970s. The land covered 60,000 acres at the foot of the Aberdare Range. It held more than 100 species of mammal, including endangered Gravy's zebra and a small breeding population of black rhinoceros. The Wildensteins ran it partly as a conservation program and partly as a private sporting estate. Alec spent weeks at a time there, hunting, riding, drinking. He had been there a week when Jocelyn arrived in the autumn of 1977. They met at dinner under canvas. He noticed her shooting the next morning. He noticed her composure. He noticed her refusal to perform for him. They rode out together at dawn for the next 3 days. By the end of the week, he had brought her into the main lodge. By the end of the month, she had agreed to spend the winter at the ranch with him. She had no idea what she was walking into. She knew only that the man across the fire was not bored when he looked at her. And after 37 years of being looked at by bored men, that was enough. Chapter 3. A Wedding. At the end of the world. They married at the ranch in 1978, far from Daniel's reach, and that was the only victory she would ever win cleanly. The ceremony was small. There were a few friends from Paris, a few from Geneva. There was no priest from the Wildenstein parish, no rabbi from the Wildenstein side of the family, no acknowledgement from Daniel that the wedding was happening at all. They were married by a Kenyan magistrate. Jocelyn signed the register as Parise. Alec signed as Wildenstein. The witnesses were 2 of the ranch's senior staff. Daniel was furious when he heard. He had wanted Alec to marry inside the closed world of European old money. He had assembled a list of candidates over the years, daughters of bankers, daughters of industrialists, daughters of art-collecting families whose own galleries might one day be folded into the Wildenstein operation. He had not expected his elder son to marry a Swiss adventuress without a fortune of her own. He never said so to his face. He simply, from that day, treated Jocelyn with a polite distance that never thawed. He referred to her in private as Jocelyn the African. The family adopted the name. It was not affectionate. The first years of the marriage were the happiest of her life. She and Alec divided the year between Old Jogi, Paris, and New York. They had a child quickly, a daughter named Diane, born in 1979. A son, Alec Jr., followed in 1980. Jocelyn discovered she liked motherhood. She kept the children close, took them on safari at 2 and 3, walked them through the gallery on East 64th Street, and held their small hands up to dark and varnished paintings she could not yet identify. She was learning. She would learn for years. She would never catch up. The household around her was enormous. The townhouse on East 64th Street had a full staff of cooks, maids, footmen, and security. The chalet at Megève in the French Alps was kept ready year-round. The Kenyan ranch was kept ready year-round. The villa at Saint-Tropez was kept ready year-round. There was a private aircraft. There was a small fleet of cars in every city. The annual operating cost of the household, as her divorce lawyers would later argue, ran to $60 million a year. She did not run the accounts. Alec ran them with assistance from a Wildenstein accountant in Paris. She lived inside the spending as though it were weather. She dressed extraordinarily through these years. She wore Givenchy in the daytime and Dior or Saint Laurent in the evenings. She wore the Wildenstein emeralds and diamonds drawn from the family vault. The pieces were rotated, like the paintings on the walls, between events. She did not own most of them. She wore them as an extension of the family's display. She did not yet, in the first years, understand that the same applied to her. She was, in a way, she would not begin to grasp until the late 1980s, part of the inventory. The art on the walls of the townhouse rotated as well. A Vermeer might hang above the staircase one month and a Bonnard the next. The dining room held works that, on any given evening, were worth tens of millions of dollars. The guests at the dinners that filled those rooms were the most powerful collectors in the world. The Rothschilds, the Mellons, the Annenbergs, the Niarchos family, the Al-Thani family of Qatar. She presided. She wore the right clothes, made the right small talk, held the right glass at the right height for the right length of time. She was good at it. In photographs from those years, she looks alert, amused, beautiful. The face is unaltered. The smile is restrained in the European fashion. The poise is the poise of a woman who has decided that she belongs in the room and dares anyone to disagree. By her early 40s, she was the Wildenstein hostess, and the Wildenstein hostess in those years was one of the most powerful unwritten positions in the international art world. She did not understand, sitting at the head of the table on East 64th Street, that the position had nothing to do with her. It belonged to the family. It could be moved like a painting to a different wall or stored like an inventory item in the dark. Chapter 4. Inside the vault. She did not own. In Paris, she was shown the Wildenstein storage facility for the first time, and what she saw there would change the way she understood her marriage. The facility sat near the Champs-Élysées, in a discreet block in the 8th arrondissement. From the street, it looked like an office building. Inside, behind two sets of steel doors and a security desk staffed 24 hours a day, was a series of climate-controlled rooms holding what the family kept private. Press estimates over the years suggested between 5,000 and 10,000 works at any one time. Estimates of value range from $5 billion to $10 billion. The family had never published an inventory and would not. Alec walked her through the rooms. He pointed things out the way another man would point out the contents of a wine cellar. There were Vermeers, plural. There was a small Caravaggio. There were Fragonards by the dozen, Watteaus, Bonnards, an entire wall of unframed Cézanne studies. There were boxes she could not see inside, and Alec said little about them. There were drawers of drawings, drawer after drawer. There were sculptures wrapped in muslin. There were Manets stacked back to back, and crates marked simply with numbers. She walked through it all and tried not to show what she felt. What she felt was a strange chill, not greed, not awe. Something more like the realization that she had been living for 6 years inside a fortune whose actual shape she had never been told. Daniel had built the structure behind the storage facility over decades. The inventory did not, on paper, belong to any single person. It belonged to a chain of holding companies and trusts based in the Bahamas, the Cayman Islands, the British Channel Islands, and Switzerland. The trusts were the property of the Wildenstein family in a moral sense, and the property of legal abstractions in a practical sense. They had been designed by Parisian and Swiss lawyers to insulate the holdings against French inheritance tax, against American probate, against the curiosity of journalists, and against the demands of spouses or children who might one day try to claim a share. Daniel had explained this architecture to Alec and Guy when they were teenagers. He had never explained it to Jocelyn. He never would. By the late 1980s, she began to ask questions. She asked Alec quietly about which paintings were considered hers, and the answer was that none were. She asked which paintings were considered Diane's and Alec Jr.'s, and the answer was that the question would be decided by trustees, not by her. She asked who controlled the storage facility, and the answer was Daniel and a small Paris office. She asked finally what she had in her own name. The answer was the jewelry on her body when she traveled, and a handful of small accounts she ran for household expenses. The townhouse was held in a Wildenstein company. The Kenyon ranch was held in a Wildenstein company. The chalet, the villa, the apartments she had been promised. All companies, all Daniels. The shock did not turn her against Alec at once. She loved him. She convinced herself she had simply not understood the workings of a great fortune, and that the working was the same everywhere, and that the affection of her husband was what protected her. She watched in the next few years as that affection began to dilute. He traveled more without her. He came back later. He kept lovers in 3 cities. She heard about them from friends. She did not confront him at first. She studied him instead, the way she had once studied animals on the savannah, looking for the small change in posture that meant a shift in mood. She studied her own face too. She studied it in the long mirrors of the townhouse. She studied it in the harsh light of dressing rooms in Paris. She compared it to the photographs of the women Alec was taking to dinner now in his absences. They were younger. They were taller in some cases. They were not, by any honest reckoning, more beautiful than she had been at 30. They were simply newer. They were a fresh consignment. She began to understand the inventory logic of the world she had married into. There were paintings on the walls, and there were women in his bed, and the cycle of refreshment was the same for both. The wall stayed, the inventory rotated. In the spring of 1990, a friend in Paris recommended a discreet surgeon. Jocelyn booked a consultation. She booked a procedure. She told Alec nothing. She told the children nothing. The procedure was a brow lift. The result was modest. She looked for a few weeks rested. Alec noticed nothing or pretended to notice nothing. She felt encouraged. She booked another procedure. She told no one again. She was beginning a habit that would define the second half of her life, and that the world would, in time, define for her. Daniel, in Paris, heard about the procedures from his network and made a note in his private file. He treated cosmetic surgery as evidence of weakness. He filed the information away. The Wildenstein family had a long memory and a precise sense of when to use what it knew. It would use this against her, in time. For now, she walked through the storage facility on her visits to Paris, looked at the Vermeers and the Fragonards on her own, and tried not to think about the day that the family lawyers might, on Daniel's instruction, take all of it away. Chapter 5. The first cut was not the last. She had been beautiful enough to interest Alec in her late 30s, and now, in her late 40s, she watched his eyes follow younger women. The shift was gradual. He had always had affairs. She had known, on some level, from the start. But through the 1980s, the affairs had been intermittent and far enough away that she could survive them. In the early 1990s, they accelerated. She began to find them next door, in the small hours, at the same dinner tables she still presided over. He stopped bothering to hide them. She began to think there was no point in confronting him about each one, because each one had been replaced by another by the time she heard about it. So she focused on the face. The procedures came in sequence. There was the brow lift, there was a first set of eyelid surgeries, there were cheek implants, there was a lip enhancement she would later regret deeply. There were chin implants, removed, replaced, removed again. There were repeated facelifts. She moved between surgeons in Paris, in Brazil, in Switzerland, in New York. She rarely told the same surgeon what the others had done. She rarely told Alec what she was doing. She told no one what it was costing her, in money and in pain. The total spent over the years that followed was estimated by various press sources at between $1 million and $4 million. She has, in interviews late in life, said it was lower. The surgeons themselves never published their fees. The cumulative effect on her face was not what she had wanted. She had wanted to look, in her own words, like a young woman. She had wanted to interest her husband again. What the procedures produced was a face that did not look like her own previous face, and did not look like a young woman either. It looked like a strange new third thing. The eyelids curved upward in an unfamiliar arc. The cheekbones rose. The lips swelled and thinned. The jawline set in a hard new geometry. A friend in Paris told her gently, over coffee in 1994, that she should stop. She did not. The friend never spoke to her about it again. By the middle of the decade, the press began to notice. Society columnists at the New York Daily News and the New York Post wrote elliptically about her appearance. Photographs of her at gallery openings began to be juxtaposed with photographs of her at the same events 3 or 4 years earlier. The juxtapositions were cruel. They were also good business. The papers learned that Jocelyn Wildenstein moved copies. They printed more photographs. They sent reporters to the openings she was likely to attend. They watched with a clinical kind of attention for the next visible change. She did not stop. The press attention seemed perversely to push her further. She had decided by this point that the procedures were her own business and that the criticism was the criticism of people who did not understand her marriage. She kept booking the surgeries. She kept paying for them out of the household funds Alec controlled or out of small accounts she ran herself. She kept telling Alec little. He, for his part, said nothing in public and very little in private. Friends of his later said he had begged her to stop. She said in late interviews that he had not. The truth probably lies somewhere in between, in the way truth often does between a husband and a wife who have stopped speaking to each other plainly. The other women in his life were, by the middle of the decade, more visible. He took a Russian model to lunches at La Grenouille. He took another to Café Bouloud. He brought a third to dinner at a Wildenstein client's home in the Hamptons. The community of waiters, doormen, and drivers in Manhattan all knew. The community of art world wives all knew. The press all knew. The papers did not yet print most of it. The Wildenstein name protected him for now. The protection would not last. In the spring of 1997, Jocelyn, by her own account, found a small piece of jewelry in their bedroom that did not belong to her. It was a young woman's earring. She put it in the drawer where she kept her own jewelry. She did not say anything to Alec. She watched him for the next few months with the same patience she had used on the Savannah. She watched for the change in his posture that would tell her where to look. By September, she knew. She knew by then almost everything. She had been preparing herself, slowly, for what she would do when she finally caught him. She did not know yet that what she would catch him with was not just another lover. It was a Magnum revolver. It would not be pulled the way the tabloids would later print, but it would be pulled in the same room, and the night it was pulled would split her life cleanly in two. Chapter 6. The Night. The revolver came out. She came home in the early hours of September of 1997, climbed the staircase past a Caravaggio, and opened the bedroom door. The night had begun without drama. She had been at a dinner downtown. She had come home, as was her habit, after midnight. She had let herself in through the front door of the townhouse on East 64th Street. The security staff knew her. They did not stop her. The household was quiet. She climbed the staircase to the second floor, walked past the Caravaggio, walked past the small Vermeer at the top of the stairs, and turned down the hallway to the bedroom she shared with Alec. What she saw, by her own account, was Alec in bed with a 19-year-old Russian model named Anna Obregon. The two of them, she said, did not see her come in at first. She stood in the doorway for what she later described as a long time. Then she screamed or said something sharp or did both. Alec, she said, woke quickly and reached for the bedside drawer. In the drawer was a Magnum revolver he had kept there for years. He pulled it out by her account and pointed it at her. The young woman in the bed grabbed for the sheet. Jocelyn backed out of the doorway, down the hall, down the staircase, through the front door, and across the street to a neighbor's apartment. She called the police from there. The 19th Precinct sent 2 patrol officers within minutes. They climbed the staircase Jocelyn had come down. They found Alec dressed and calm. They arrested him in the front hall. They did not find the revolver immediately. It was, the next day, recovered from the bedside drawer, where Alec had placed it after Jocelyn fled. The young woman had dressed and left during the interval. Alec was taken to the 19th Precinct holding cell. He was photographed there. He was released on bail within hours. The charges in the months that followed were quietly dropped. The Wildenstein lawyers handled it. The district attorney's office moved on. The press did not move on. The New York Daily News ran the story on its front page within 48 hours. The story had everything. It had a great fortune. It had a beautiful 19-year-old. It had a revolver. It had a wife who had been transforming her face in a series of procedures the same paper had been documenting for years. It had a husband from a family the New York art world had only ever spoken about in whispers. The Wildenstein name, which had survived a century of careful protection, was on the front page next to a photograph of Alec in handcuffs. Daniel Wildenstein, in Paris, was reported to have phoned his son and ordered him, in 3 sentences, to settle whatever needed settling and to do it now. Jocelyn did not return to the townhouse. She moved into a suite at the Plaza Athénée in Paris within the week, and then into a different apartment in New York within the month. She hired the divorce lawyer Bernard Clare. Clare was a New York attorney who had built a practice on the divorces of the very wealthy. He had a reputation for patience, for thoroughness, and for a willingness to follow the money into structures that other lawyers would not touch. She told him in their first meeting that she wanted everything Alec owed her. She told him she did not know what the family was worth, and that she suspected Alec did not entirely know either. She told him she wanted him to find out. Clare filed within 10 days. The petition was long. It asked in its early pages for an accounting of the Wildenstein art inventory. It asked for the records of the trusts in the Bahamas, the Channel Islands, and the Caymans. It asked for the ownership documents of the Old Jogi Ranch, the Megève Chalet, the Saint-Tropez Villa, and the townhouse on East 64th Street. It asked for the names of the trustees. It asked for the schedule of consignments at the Paris storage facility for the previous 10 years. It asked, in short, for the secrecy that had been the entire commercial advantage of the Wildenstein operation to be turned inside out in a Manhattan courtroom. Daniel, in Paris, read the petition and went pale. Alec, in New York, read the petition and called his father. The Wildenstein lawyers met for several days. The instructions, when they came back to Alec, were the only instructions Daniel would ever give him on this matter. Settle. Settle on any terms. Settle now. Do not let this petition produce a single page of discovery. Do not let a single trustee be deposed. Do not let a single appraiser inside the storage facility. Pay her whatever she demands. Bernard Clare, in his office at 67th Street and Lexington Avenue, sat down with Jocelyn and explained what was happening. He told her that the family would settle. He told her that the only question was how much. He told her not to be afraid of the press. He told her not to talk to the press at all. He told her that the next 6 months would be the hardest of her life, and that, at the end of them, she would be one of the wealthiest divorced women in the world. She nodded. She believed him. She did not yet understand that being a wealthy divorced woman in the world the Wildensteins had made was not the same as being free of them. Chapter 7. The Lawyer Who Knew Too Much. Bernard Clare sat down across from Alec's lawyers and asked one question that brought the Wildenstein fortune to its knees. The question was put quietly in a conference room at a Park Avenue law firm, late in 1997. Clare set his notes on the table. He asked the Wildenstein lawyers whether the family was prepared, under deposition, to identify the actual beneficial owners of the holdings at the storage facility in the 8th arrondissement of Paris. He waited. He let the silence sit. He watched the senior partner across from him glance just once at the junior partner beside him. He had his answer before anyone said a word. The Wildenstein lawyers asked for a recess. They went into another conference room. They were there for nearly an hour. When they came back, they did not answer the question. They proposed a number. The number was higher than the first numbers that had been floated through back channels. Clare listened. He thanked them. He told them he would discuss the number with his client. He left. Over the next 2 months, the negotiation moved in 2 directions at once. The Wildenstein lawyers pushed Clare to accept a fixed lump sum and a release. Clare pushed back. He pointed to the petition. He pointed to the discovery motions he had already filed but not yet pressed. He pointed to the depositions he could schedule of the Bahamian and Channel Islands trustees. He had identified them. He had subpoena power if he chose to use it. He let the Wildenstein lawyers understand that he understood what they had built. He let them understand that the cost of stopping him from exposing it was very high indeed, but not infinite. Daniel, in Paris, watched. He had not come to New York. He never would. He sent instructions through his counsel. Pay, get the release, get the discovery motions withdrawn, get the depositions canceled, make the storage facility, the trusts, the names of the trustees, the schedule of consignments, all of it vanish from the case. The cost did not matter. The reputation of the firm did. The architecture he had built over 40 years could not survive the kind of light Clare was preparing to shine on it. The settlement that emerged was the largest divorce settlement of its era. The lump sum, as reported by multiple sources at the time, was $2.5 billion. The maintenance schedule was $100 million a year for 13 years, payable through to 2012. The release covered every Wildenstein entity, every trust, every holding company, every gallery, every storage facility, every paintings inventory, and every ranch and chalet and villa. Jocelyn would receive no share of the art. She would receive no share of the Kenyon ranch. She would receive the lump sum and the maintenance and a few specified personal effects. There was one further clause that the press would later make famous. The Wildenstein lawyers, in a final round of negotiation, had asked for a clause that prohibited Jocelyn from spending any of the settlement on further cosmetic surgery. The clause was, on the surface, a strange thing for a divorce agreement to contain. The Wildenstein lawyers had argued for it on the basis that any future change in her appearance would be associated with the family name and would damage the family's image. Clare had pushed back. He had eventually agreed, with Jocelyn's reluctant consent, to a softer version of the clause. The clause was real, even in its softer form. She would violate it almost immediately. The settlement was finalized in 1999. The judge approved it. The press ran the numbers. The headlines that month covered them all. $2.5 billion, $100 million a year. The largest divorce in American history. The cat lady and the playboy. The arrest, the Russian model, the Magnum revolver. Jocelyn Wildenstein, in a single news cycle, became one of the most famous women in the world. She was not famous for what she wanted to be famous for. She wanted to be famous as the woman who had taken on the most secretive art-dealing family in the world and won. She was famous instead as the cat lady whose ex-husband had been caught at 4 a.m. with a teenage Russian model. The story she carried into the world, the story Bernard Clare had won for her in conference rooms on Park Avenue, was not the story the world wanted to tell about her. The story the world wanted to tell was the story of the surgeon's knife. The surgeon's knife would be the only story she would carry in the public mind for the next 25 years. Daniel Wildenstein in Paris paid up. He signed off on every wire transfer. He instructed Alec to keep the press release to a single neutral sentence. He went back to his catalogs, raisonné. He went back to the storage facility. He went back to the gallery. He had bought silence. He had bought it dearly, but he had bought it. 2 years later, he died in Paris, in his bed, at the age of 84. He left behind a fortune that no one outside the family could measure, and a daughter-in-law in New York who had carved her face into a new shape because she had wanted, more than anything in the world, to keep loving his son. 1. Chapter 8. $2.5 billion. The settlement made her one of the wealthiest divorced women in the world, with a single private clause she could not abide. The $2.5 billion lump sum arrived in tranches. The maintenance arrived in monthly transfers. She had, in her early 60s, more money in her own name than she had ever had access to as Alec's wife. She had, as Bernard Clare had told her, become a wealthy divorced woman in a city full of wealthy divorced women. She had, in theory, no further need of the Wildenstein name. She did not, in practice, leave the Wildenstein name behind. She kept it. She introduced herself with it. She signed her checks with it. She wore her old emeralds and diamonds, the pieces she had been able to keep under the settlement, to dinners where everyone in the room could trace the stones back to the Paris storage facility. She continued to live, in many respects, as though she were still the Wildenstein hostess. The townhouse on East 64th Street had returned to Alec. The Kenyon Ranch had returned to the Wildenstein companies. The chalet, the villa, the apartments she had once moved between. All gone. She replaced them with a triplex apartment in the new Trump World Tower on First Avenue. She replaced the staff she had lost. She replaced the cars she had given up. She did not, however, replace the center of the household, which had been the Wildenstein name itself. The maintenance at $100 million a year was generous. The lifestyle she ran out of it was not sustainable even at that rate. Her annual costs, as later filings showed, ran to roughly $1 million a month. That was the staff, the apartments, the security, the travel, the wardrobe, the dinners, and the gifts. It did not on its face exhaust the maintenance. It was, however, before the surgery. The surgery did not stop. The clause in the settlement, which the press would later mock so cruelly, was honored for a few months. It was then violated. She returned to her surgeons in Paris, Brazil, Switzerland, and Manhattan. She paid them out of accounts the Wildenstein lawyers could not reach. She continued the procedures she had begun in the early 1990s. She continued them at roughly the same pace she had set during the marriage. The procedures were no longer being driven by Alex's wandering eye, which was no longer her concern. They were now being driven by something else, something she could no longer name clearly. A habit, a reflex, a way of trying to repair the woman in the mirror. The face, by the early 2000s, had moved past the point of obvious return. The eyelids had been opened and tightened so many times that the upper lid sat in a permanent arch. The cheekbones had been built up so much that they cast a hard line across the rest of the face. The lips had been altered and altered again. Her own children, by various accounts, found it painful to look at her at close range. Her grandchildren, when they came, did not know her any other way and accepted her as she was. The press, for its part, did not let up. Every photograph was juxtaposed with an earlier photograph. Every news segment was framed around the face. The other expenses mounted. She loaned several $1 million to the French fashion designer Lloyd Klein, with whom she had begun a relationship in the early 2000s to fund his business. The business struggled. The loans were not repaid. She made gifts and loans to friends in Paris, in Geneva, in New York. She made gifts to staff. She made gifts to family members in Switzerland. She invested in projects that failed, including a cosmetics line and a perfume line. She paid legal fees in a series of small disputes. None of these costs on its own was catastrophic. Together, year after year, they ate into the capital. The maintenance ended in 2012 on schedule. The 13-year payment plan ran its course. The Wildensteins paid the final tranche on time and never paid another dollar. The lump sum by then was significantly depleted. Her advisors warned her. She did not listen, or she listened and did not change. By the middle of the decade, she was selling jewelry. By the end of the decade, she would file for bankruptcy. The clause forbidding plastic surgery had, of course, been unenforceable from the start. No court would have policed it. But the clause was a signal. The Wildensteins had wanted her body, the body that bore their name, frozen at the point of separation. They had wanted her to age after the settlement, in the ordinary way, so that the public memory of the divorce would fade gracefully. She had refused. She had kept altering the face. She had, in a strange way, kept the divorce alive in the public mind for the next 25 years. She had refused to let the Wildensteins erase her. The cost of that refusal was the rest of her life. Chapter 9. The Bride of Wildenstein. The tabloids christened her overnight, and from that christening she would never get away. The name appeared in print in the New York Post in the autumn of 1998. A reporter, looking for a phrase to attach to the face, settled on the Bride of Wildenstein. The phrase was a play on The Bride of Frankenstein, the 1935 James Whale film, starring Elsa Lanchester. The reference was vicious. It compared her face to the face of a movie monster. It implied that her husband had built her, the way the original mad scientist had built his bride. It worked. The phrase traveled. The other papers picked it up. Within a year, it had become her standing nickname in the press. She hated it. She said so in interviews. She said the press had invented the cat reference, that she had never told a surgeon she wanted to look like a cat, that she had never asked for the eyelid arc, that the surgeons had given her what she had not requested. Some of this was probably true. Some of it was probably revisionist. The truth, as it usually does with cosmetic surgery, sat in the gap between the patient's intention and the surgeon's interpretation. She had not asked for a cat face. She had also not asked them to stop. She had paid them, year after year, to keep going. The damage from the nickname was specific. It changed the way her photograph was used. Editors who once would have used a flattering picture began, automatically, to use an unflattering one. Editors who once would not have run a picture at all began, automatically, to run one. Her image became a kind of free-for-all in the global image economy of the late 1990s and early 2000s. The internet, then in its early years, accelerated everything. The same photographs traveled from the New York papers to the British tabloids, to the German papers, to the Italian magazines, to the early image boards. By 2005, there was almost no corner of the global press that had not used her face, often without context, as a shorthand for cosmetic surgery gone wrong. She did not, for a long time, fight back. She gave very few interviews in the first decade after the divorce. The interviews she did give were short and cautious. She tried mostly to ignore the press. The press did not ignore her. They followed her to restaurants. They followed her to gallery openings. They followed her on holiday. The few times she came out swinging, in late-life interviews on television in Europe and on the early American chat shows, she came across as both defensive and dignified. She insisted that she had loved Alec. She insisted that she had not wanted to look like a cat. She insisted that her face was the result of small mistakes by competent surgeons. The interviewers nodded politely and ran the photographs anyway. The community she had once moved through began to close around her. The Wildenstein clients who had once accepted her dinner invitations did not invite her to theirs after the divorce. The museum events she had once attended as a Wildenstein wife stopped sending her invitations. The Costume Institute did not include her on its list. The galleries on Madison Avenue did not call her for openings. She was not technically a pariah. She could still get a table at La Grenouille. She could still get a seat at most of the restaurants she had favored. She was no longer, however, a guest at the private rooms behind those restaurants. She was no longer, in the small social geography that mattered, a person who counted. She tried to build a new public role for herself. She announced a cosmetics line. It did not launch. She announced a perfume. It did not launch. She announced a memoir. It was not written. She gave interviews to French magazines about a new venture. The venture did not arrive. The pattern was, by the middle of the 2000s, the pattern of someone trying to convert celebrity into a business without the discipline or the team to actually do so. She was unwilling to admit that her celebrity was the wrong kind. It would not sell perfume. It would only sell newspapers. The Wildensteins, in Paris and New York, watched this happen with what one observer described as a mixture of pity and satisfaction. Alec, by all accounts, did not enjoy what had happened to her. Daniel had died in 2001. Guy, who now ran the firm with Alec, said nothing publicly. The family had, in the divorce, paid a vast sum to make Jocelyn someone else's problem. They had, in the tabloid press, also paid a different price. They had become public figures in a way they had spent a century avoiding. They blamed her for that. Many people in the New York art world were inclined, with no particular justification, to agree. She realized sometime around 2005 or 6 that the door to her old world had closed permanently. The realization did not produce despair at first. It produced a kind of doubling down. She kept the apartments, she kept the staff, she kept the dinners, she bought more jewelry, she lent Lloyd Klein more money, she gave gifts to friends to keep them close. She lived in those years like a wealthy woman who was deliberately ignoring her own accountant. The accountant was, of course, correct. The fortune was bleeding. Chapter 10. A Younger Man and a Holding Cell. She fell for a French fashion designer half her age, and for almost 20 years she paid for him in every sense of the word. His name was Lloyd Klein. He had been born in Casablanca, raised partly in France, and trained as a couture designer in Paris in the 1980s. He was good-looking, modest in manner, and ambitious. He met Jocelyn in New York in the early 2000s at a dinner. They were not immediately lovers. The relationship became one over the next year. She was 60-something. He was in his 30s. The age gap in the tabloid press was treated as the next phase of her cat lady story. It was not, in fact, the most interesting thing about the relationship. The most interesting thing about the relationship was that, for the first time since Alec, she had a man at the center of her life. He moved into her apartment at Trump World Tower. He traveled with her to Paris and to the south of France. He sat with her at dinners at restaurants where the staff still remembered who she had been. He held her arm in photographs at events that 20 years earlier she had attended on Alec's arm. He gave her, by all accounts, a kind of late-life companionship she had not expected to have. He also took from her a great deal of money. She funded his fashion business. The funding was structured as loans, as advances, as straight gifts depending on the year. The business had moments of promise. There were collections shown in Paris and in New York. There were a few celebrity clients. There were investments in showrooms and in samples. None of it added up. The loans were not repaid. The advances were not earned out. The gifts were not, in the financial sense, recoverable. He continued to live in her apartment. She continued to fund his work. The pattern ran for more than a decade. The relationship was turbulent. They fought by their own accounts often. They split and reconciled. There were periods when he was not in the apartment. There were periods when he was. There were periods in the early 2010s when she gave interviews suggesting they were happily together. There were periods when she gave interviews suggesting otherwise. The pattern was not, in this respect, very different from many late-life relationships. The pattern was simply more public because she was Jocelyn Wildenstein. In December of 2016, the relationship hit its lowest public point. The two had a fight in the apartment at Trump World Tower late at night. Jocelyn, by police account, attacked him with a pair of scissors. He called the police. She was arrested. The arrest photograph, taken at the 17th precinct in the early hours of the morning, traveled the world within 12 hours. The picture showed her in a robe, her face altered, her eyes tired, her mouth set. It was almost certainly the most reproduced image of her since the divorce settlement headlines of 1999. The charges were eventually adjourned in contemplation of dismissal. She did not, in the end, face a trial. She and Klein, after a few months apart, were back together within the year. The relationship continued, with interruptions until close to her death. He was at her side in various ways through the bankruptcy proceedings. He was not, by any account, the cause of the bankruptcy. The bankruptcy was the cumulative weight of the lifestyle, the surgeries, the failed business ventures, the loans, the gifts, and the simple passage of time. She talked about the relationship, in interviews, with a strange tenderness. She did not pretend the man was perfect. She did not pretend he had no costs. She did say that he loved her. She did say that she felt seen by him. She did say in one French television interview that he was the only man who had looked at her face after the surgery and said it was beautiful. Whether the statement was true is impossible to know. It is, in any case, the kind of statement that a woman in her 70s, who had spent her 60s being photographed by editors who selected for cruelty, would very much have wanted to say out loud. Chapter 11. $900 against $6 million. Ode. In May of 2018, she filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy in Manhattan with $900 in her bank account. The filing was made in the United States Bankruptcy Court for the Southern District of New York. It listed assets of $900 in cash, a handful of personal effects, and a small amount of remaining jewelry whose appraised value she disputed. It listed debts of more than $6 million. The largest single creditor was the management company of Trump World Tower, which was pursuing her for unpaid common charges on the triplex apartment. The apartment was, on the same day, in foreclosure proceedings. The triplex had been her home for nearly 2 decades. It sat high up on First Avenue, with 3 full floors of east-facing windows over the East River. The interiors had been redone, in part by Klein, in a heavy Versailles-inspired style that the tabloids had also enjoyed at her expense. The apartment had once been worth, by various estimates, more than $7 million. It was, at the moment of the bankruptcy filing, encumbered by debt that had run past her means to service. The 13-year maintenance payments from the Wildensteins had ended in 2012. She had received by then more than $1 billion in maintenance on top of the lump sum. She had spent through nearly all of it. The legal filing offered a reasonably detailed catalog of where it had gone. The categories included household staff, the apartments at Trump World Tower, and a few smaller secondary residences, private travel, security, legal fees, the funding of Klein's business, plastic surgery, jewelry, gifts to friends and family, charitable donations, and what one accountant later described as the silent, steady leak of running a household at a level her income could no longer sustain. The filing also offered a rare public glimpse into the architecture the Wildensteins had built. The settlement, the filing noted, had not given her any share in the Wildenstein companies, the trusts, the art, the storage facility, the gallery, or the Kenyon Ranch. She had been compensated instead with cash and an annuity. The cash and the annuity had now run out. The Wildensteins, in legal terms, owed her nothing further and were not parties to the bankruptcy. They were, in legal terms, gone. The press treatment of the bankruptcy was almost gentle compared to the treatment of her face. The numbers did some of the work. $2.5 billion to $900 in 19 years was a story that did not need editorializing. The columns that ran in the New York papers in the weeks after the filing carried an unfamiliar note of pity. The financial press, for its part, treated the case as an instructive example of how even very large sums could be eroded by a high-cost lifestyle and a long string of small disappointments. Jocelyn herself was quiet through the proceedings. She did not give interviews. She did not appear at the courthouse. Her lawyers handled the filings. The foreclosure on the apartment moved through the system slowly. She remained in residence for some time. The Trump World Tower management eventually agreed to terms that allowed her to stay, in a smaller arrangement, in the building. She lived in a reduced apartment with reduced staff for the remainder of her life. The last 6 years of her life were lived in a register the press almost did not know how to cover. She was, in the strict financial sense, broke. She was also, in the social sense, a famous person whose phone still rang occasionally. She was photographed at restaurants in Manhattan in 2019, 2020, 2021, 2022, 2023, and 2024. The photographs always led with the face. They did not often mention the bankruptcy. She lived in those years a quieter life than she had lived since her early 20s in Lausanne. She read, she walked, she had dinner, when she had it, with a small number of people who still came. Klein came in and out. The children, by various accounts, did not come often. She did not, in those years, complain. She did not, in those years, publicly blame the Wildensteins for what had happened to her. She did not, in interviews, regret the surgery. She did, however, in one French interview in 2023, say something that has stayed in the record. She was asked, near the end of the conversation, what she would say to Alec if she could speak to him now. She paused. She said, in French, that she would tell him she had loved him from the night at the campfire, and that nothing in between had changed that. The interviewer, a young French journalist who had clearly come prepared to be unkind, did not have a follow-up question. Chapter 12. The Last Photograph. On the table. A few weeks before she died, she sat for a photograph at a Manhattan restaurant, smiling at a friend across the table. The friend was a young woman who had come to dinner to listen to her stories. The restaurant was in Midtown. The light was warm. The photograph showed Jocelyn in a high-necked dark dress, her hair pulled back, her face turned slightly towards the camera. The smile was small. The eyes were tired. The whole picture had a quietness about it. It was not the kind of picture the tabloids ever ran. It was the kind of picture a friend takes of another friend across a dinner table, late, after the second glass of wine. It would, after her death 2 weeks later, be among the few late photographs of her that the obituaries would use. She died on the 31st of December, 2024, in her apartment at Trump World Tower. The cause was reported as a pulmonary embolism. She had been ill by some accounts in the weeks before. By other accounts, she had simply been frail. She was 84. Lloyd Klein was the one who confirmed her death to the press. The press, in turn, ran obituaries in newspapers across the world. Almost every one of them led with the cat lady reference. Almost every one of them used a photograph from the late 1990s or early 2000s rather than a recent picture. Almost every one of them mentioned the $2.5 billion divorce and the $900 bankruptcy filing in the same paragraph. The Wildenstein family, in Paris and New York, said nothing publicly. Guy Wildenstein did not issue a statement. The Wildenstein and Company Gallery on East 64th Street did not close for the day. Diane and Alec Jr. did not give interviews. The family had spent more than 2 decades trying to put Jocelyn behind it. Her death, for them, did not require a public response. She was buried quietly. The funeral, by various accounts, was small. A handful of friends, Klein, a few neighbors from the building, none of the Wildensteins. The Kenyan ranch did not lower its flag. The storage facility in Paris did not close its doors. What survives her, in concrete terms, is mixed. The Wildenstein and Company business survives. The Wildenstein-Plattner Institute, established with the technology executive Hasso Plattner, has taken over much of the catalog's raisonnés work Daniel began. The old Jogi Ranch, restructured into a charitable foundation in 2014, survives as one of the most important private conservation programs in East Africa. The French legal proceedings against Guy Wildenstein for tax fraud and concealment of inheritance, sparked indirectly by the long shadow of the divorce, continued in various forms through the 20-teens and 2020s. The architecture Daniel built is intact, mostly, and the family is still mostly untouchable. What survives Jocelyn herself is harder to place. She left no foundation. She left no business. She did not write a book. She did not endow a chair. She did not establish a hospital wing. She did not, in the usual ways of the wealthy, leave a footprint anyone can point to. What she left instead was a public memory of a face the world had spent 30 years using as a punchline. That memory is, almost certainly, the only thing about her that most people will ever know. The temptation, in telling this story, is to leave the audience there, to leave Jocelyn as a cautionary tale about vanity, about the dangers of cosmetic surgery, about the foolishness of a woman who spent $2.5 billion and died with 900. The temptation is to use the line the tabloids used, to call her the cat lady, to shake the head, to move on. The temptation is wrong, or at least incomplete. Jocelyn Wildenstein was not in the end a vain woman who destroyed her own face. She was a Swiss adventuress who walked into a closed dynastic fortune at 37 and learned, slowly, that the fortune did not belong to her, that the husband did not belong to her, and that the only thing in her world that the family could not legally take back was the body she had brought through the door at the wedding. She used what she had been given. She used the only tool she had been told was hers. She used it badly. She used it self-destructively. She used it until there was almost nothing left of the original woman who had stood across a campfire in 1977 and met the eyes of a man who, for the first time in her life, had not looked bored when he looked at her. What we owe her, perhaps, is the simple courtesy of telling the story straight. Not the tabloid version, not the punchline. The story of a woman who loved a husband whose family taught him not to love her back. The story of a woman who used a fortune she did not understand to chase a feeling that was already gone. The story of an outsider wife inside a closed fortune, used and discarded, mocked in life, half eulogized in death. There are many women like her in the history of American old wealth. Most of their names have already been forgotten. Hers, for the moment, has not. It is worth using the moment while we still have it to remember her as more than the joke that her face became. If this story stayed with you, subscribe so the next one finds you. And tell me in the comments what you think of Jocelyn Wildenstein. Was she a vain woman who destroyed herself? Or was she a wife who used the only fortune she could touch to chase a husband who had already left her? I want to hear your take.